sun was setting behind the jagged peaks of Mount Blackville, casting long shadows over the dense forest that surrounded the base of the mountain. A group of 5 American geology students, Emily, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and Chris, had set up camp near the summit of the dormant volcano. They were there to study the geological formations and collect data for their final project. The mountain had been inactive for centuries, and the locals rarely ventured near it, whispering tales of curses and lost souls. But the students dismissed these stories as mere folklore, eager to prove their scientific prowess. The first night was uneventful. They set up a large, comfortable tent, complete with sleeping bags, a portable stove, and all the equipment they needed for their research. The air was crisp, and the stars above were breathtaking. They laughed around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows, completely unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The next morning, they began their exploration. The mountain was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. As they hiked closer to the crater, Emily noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound. It was as if the wind itself was speaking, but the words were just out of reach. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" Jake replied, adjusting his backpack. "It's just the wind." But Emily wasn't convinced. The whispers seemed to grow louder the closer they got to the crater. By the time they reached the edge, the sound was almost deafening, yet no one else seemed to notice. She shook it off, attributing it to her imagination, and focused on collecting rock samples. That night, as they sat around the campfire, the whispering returned. This time, it wasn't just Emily who heard it. Sarah froze, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The group fell silent, listening intently. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, a chorus of voices speaking in a language none of them could understand. The fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the tent walls. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive sense of dread. "Let's get inside," Mike said, his voice shaky. They hurried into the tent, zipping it up tightly, but the whispers followed them, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if the voices were inside the tent, surrounding them. The next morning, the mountain was shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. Visibility was reduced to just a few feet, and the air was damp and cold. The group decided to stay close to the campsite, but as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. Chris was the first to notice the shadows. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the fog. But then he saw it again. A tall, humanoid figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching them. He called out to the others, but by the time they turned to look, the figure was gone. As the day progressed, the shadows became more frequent. They moved unnaturally, darting between the trees, always just out of sight. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the group began to feel as though they were being watched. That night, the fog thickened, and the temperature plummeted. The group huddled inside the tent, trying to ignore the whispers and the occasional sound of footsteps outside. But then, something scratched at the tent wall, a long, slow drag of claws against the fabric. They froze, their breaths visible in the cold air. "Stay quiet," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. But the scratching continued, growing more frantic. Suddenly, the tent zipper began to move on its own, slowly inching downward. Emily screamed, and the group scrambled to hold the zipper shut. The scratching stopped, and the whispers faded into silence. The next morning, the fog had lifted, but the mountain felt even more oppressive. The group decided to explore the area near the crater, hoping to find some answers. As they hiked, they stumbled upon the ruins of an ancient village, crumbling stone houses overgrown with moss and vines. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, and the ground was littered with charred debris. In the center of the village was a large stone altar, covered in strange symbols. Emily recognized them from her studies. They were ancient warnings, meant to ward off evil spirits, but it was clear that whatever they were meant to protect against had already come. As they explored the ruins, they found fragments of pottery, tools, and even human bones. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the shadows began to close in. The group realized with growing horror that they were not alone. The spirits of the villagers who had died in the volcanic eruption were still there, trapped on the mountain. That night, the group decided to leave the mountain. They packed up their equipment and prepared to hike down at first light. But as they sat around the campfire, the whispers turned into screams, agonized, blood-curdling screams that echoed through the night. The shadows emerged from the trees, taking on the forms of the villagers. Their faces were twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The group tried to run, but the spirits surrounded them, their cold hands reaching out, pulling them back. Emily woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. She was back in the tent. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she noticed the faint whispers. The whispers did not stop. Emily sat upright, her breath coming in short gasps. The tent was suffocating, the air thick with an unnatural silence. She glanced around at the others, their faces pale, their eyes sunken with exhaustion. None of them had truly slept. The whispers had followed them into their dreams, filling their minds with visions of fire, death, and endless darkness. "We have to leave," Jake muttered, gripping his flashlight. "Now." No one argued. They gathered their belongings in a frantic rush, not even bothering to eat. The only thought consuming them was escape. The forest, once a dense, vibrant green, now felt like a cage, each tree a silent observer of their impending doom. As they trudged down the mountain path, the fog thickened once more, curling around them like grasping fingers. The path beneath their feet seemed to shift, stretching longer than it should. Every step felt like walking in place, as if the mountain itself refused to let them go. Then Sarah screamed. They turned to see her frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her, looming in the mist, was a figure, tall, gaunt, and faceless. Its elongated fingers reached toward her, and as it touched her shoulder, Sarah convulsed violently, her scream cutting off into an eerie silence. Her body stiffened, her skin turning an ashen gray. "Run!" Chris shouted, but it was too late. More figures emerged from the fog, their hollow eyes fixated on the group. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching toward them with an agonizing slowness. Mike grabbed Sarah's wrist, trying to pull her free, but she was no longer there. Her body crumbled to dust in his hands. Panic surged through them. They ran blindly, the whispers morphing into guttural wails. The trees blurred, the ground shifted, and soon they were no longer on the trail. Instead, they stood at the entrance of a cavern, a gaping mouth in the earth, its depths breathing out a foul, sulfuric stench. "This wasn't here before," Emily stammered. "We don't have a choice," Jake urged. "They're right behind us." Without hesitation, they plunged into the darkness. The air inside was thick, pressing against their lungs. The walls pulsed as if alive, the stone veins glowing with an eerie crimson light. The deeper they went, the more distorted reality became. Shadows moved independently of light, whispering voices called them by name, and the air crackled with an unseen energy. They turned a corner and came upon a massive underground chamber. At its center stood an altar, identical to the one in the cursed village above. But this one was not abandoned. A figure stood before it. Its back was hunched, its flesh peeling like old parchment. It wore tattered remnants of ancient robes, and in its skeletal hands, it cradled a pulsating obsidian heart. As the group watched in horror, it turned to face them, its mouth stretching into an impossible grin. "You have come home." The voice was not one but many, a chorus of tortured souls speaking in unison. "What do you want?" Mike demanded, stepping forward. The figure's grin widened. "You were chosen. The mountain has claimed you, as it has claimed all before you." The ground trembled. The cavern walls shrieked, splitting open to reveal more figures, their eyeless faces locked in eternal agony. They were the lost souls, the villagers, the wanderers, the ones who had come before. And now they had new company. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. The air tightened around them, the darkness swallowing them whole. One by one they fell. Chris, then Mike, then Jake. Their bodies twisted unnaturally as they were pulled into the stone itself, their screams swallowed by the mountain. Emily was the last. She clawed at the ground, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, "I don't want to die." The figure knelt beside her, tilting its head. "You will not die. You will become." A final whisper echoed through the cavern. And then there was silence. Weeks later, a new expedition arrived at Mount Blackvile to investigate the disappearance of the students. They found nothing. No tent, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. But the whispers remained. And on certain nights, when the wind howled through the trees, travelers swore they could hear voices, pleading, begging, warning. The mountain had new souls, and it was always hungry for more.